Julian Ashford stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, looking down at the city he practically owned. The Ashford Group was on the verge of the biggest merger in its history, but there was one absurd catch. The conservative board of the rival company demanded stability. They wanted a family man, not a notorious bachelor, to lead the new empire. Julian needed a wife, and he needed one by Friday. Enter Sienna Hayes. She had been working as his personal assistant for exactly 3 weeks, and Julian had made every single day a living hell for her. She was supposed to be quiet, obedient, and invisible. Instead, Sienna was fiercely intelligent, refused to back down when he raised his voice, and had a habit of looking at him as if he were just a stubborn child rather than a billionaire. When she walked into his office that afternoon to hand him his schedule, he did not look at the papers. He looked at her. He offered her $1 million and the complete clearing of her mother's medical debts if she would sign a 6-month marriage contract. Sienna laughed in his face. She told him his money could not buy her dignity. But as the silence stretched between them, the reality of her mother's failing health weighed heavily on her mind. She agreed on one condition. There would be no physical contact, and she would maintain her own bank account. Julian agreed, amused and slightly irritated by her defiance. The wedding was a sterile affair in a judge's chambers. Sienna wore a simple dress she bought off the rack, deliberately ignoring the designer gowns Julian had sent to her apartment. Standing in the back of the room was Marcus Devereux, Julian's oldest business partner. Marcus clapped when they sealed the contract with a stiff, obligatory kiss, but his eyes were calculating and cold. He knew Julian too well to believe this sudden romance. Moving into Julian's sprawling estate was a shock for Sienna, but she refused to let the luxury soften her edges. The tension between them crackled during every forced public appearance. At a charity gala, a foreign investor tried to humiliate Sienna by questioning her background. Before Julian could intervene, Sienna dismantled the man's argument with flawless grace and sharp business acumen. Julian watched her, a strange new feeling blooming in his chest. That night, when Julian suffered a severe migraine from the stress of the merger, Sienna did not call the staff. She sat by his bed in the dark, pressing a cool towel to his forehead, her touch gentle and completely devoid of the sharp armor she usually wore. The fragile piece shattered 2 weeks later. Julian was looking through some old files in his private study when he found a background check on Sienna that Marcus had ordered. Sienna Hayes, daughter of Arthur Hayes. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. 10 years ago, the Ashford Group had aggressively taken over Hayes Manufacturing, a move orchestrated by Julian's father that ended in Arthur losing everything. Julian confronted her immediately. He asked her if this was all a long game for revenge. Sienna did not flinch, though tears shone in her eyes. She told him she had not known who he was when she applied for the job, but when she found out, she stayed because she needed the money to save what was left of her family. She told him that looking at him every day was a reminder of the greed that destroyed her father. The truth hung between them, bitter and undeniable. For days, they lived like ghosts in the same house. The silence was deafening, but Julian could not ignore the guilt gnawing at him, nor could he ignore how much he missed her voice. He started leaving her favorite black coffee on her desk exactly how she liked it. He cancelled high-profile meetings just to be home when she returned from visiting her mother. He did not buy her diamonds, he simply gave her his time. But Marcus was not idle. Seeing the friction between them, Marcus leaked a fabricated story to the press, claiming Sienna was a corporate spy planted to sabotage the merger. He presented forged documents to the board, demanding Julian step down and hand the company over to him. The scandal erupted overnight. Julian and Sienna stood together in the chaotic boardroom, facing a sea of angry investors and a smug Marcus. But Marcus had underestimated them. Sienna stepped forward, projecting absolute confidence. She placed a thick dossier on the mahogany table. It was not a defense of her character, but a detailed trail of offshore accounts and embezzled funds. She and Julian had spent the last 3 nights tracking Marcus's hidden financial crimes. The room fell dead silent as the board members flipped through the undeniable proof. Marcus's smug smile vanished, replaced by pale panic. He tried to laugh it off, tried to walk out, but security was already blocking the doors. He was stripped of his shares and escorted out of the building, humiliated in front of the very people he had tried to manipulate. That evening, the penthouse was quiet. Julian stood by the same windows where it all began, but this time, he was not looking at the city. He was looking at Sienna. He did not offer her a new contract. Instead, he offered a genuine apology. He told her he could not undo the past, but he wanted to build a future with her, not as an agreement, but as a true partnership. He told her he loved her. Sienna looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he hid from the rest of the world, and finally let down her guard. She stepped into his arms, knowing the man holding her was no longer the ruthless billionaire she first met. Months passed, and the fake marriage became a real one. Sienna did not return to being an assistant. With Julian's unwavering support and her own brilliant mind, she launched the Hayes Foundation, dedicated to helping small businesses survive corporate takeovers. They stood side by side at the foundation's opening gala, equals in every way. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time. The salt air of the harbor always cleared Adrian Vale's mind, but today nothing could extinguish his anger. As the CEO of Vale Maritime, he was used to navigating treacherous waters, but the letter resting on his mahogany desk was a storm he had not anticipated. His late grandfather's will contained a bizarre ironclad clause. Adrian had exactly 30 days to marry, or his controlling shares would automatically transfer to his manipulative ex-fiancée, Genevieve Roth. Genevieve had always known how to play the old man, and now she was poised to steal Adrian's entire life's work. Adrian did not have time for romance, nor did he trust the women in his elite social circle who were already loyal to Genevieve. He instructed his lawyers to place a highly discreet, incredibly vague advertisement for a lucrative short-term private contracting role. Margot Ellis was exhausted. Working double shifts at a diner near the docks barely paid the rent for her tiny, crumbling apartment. When she saw the advertisement promising a life-changing sum for a 6-month commitment, she assumed it was an intense catering or event management gig. She walked into the gleaming glass tower of Vale Maritime, wearing her only decent suit, completely unfazed by the intimidating wealth around her. When she finally sat across from Adrian, she did not lower her eyes. He was struck by her fierce independence. When he bluntly explained the true nature of the job, proposing a fake marriage, Margot laughed. She told him his world was a gilded cage, and she had no interest in being his prize bird. But as she stood to leave, her eyes quickly scanned a complex shipping manifest on his desk, and she casually pointed out a critical logistical error that his top executives had missed. Adrian was intrigued. He doubled the financial offer, enough money to guarantee she would never have to work a grueling shift again. Reluctantly, seeing a chance for total financial freedom, Margot agreed. The paperwork was signed in a cold, silent room. There was no celebration, only a rigid contract outlining their boundaries. Margot moved into Adrian's sprawling mansion, but she refused to let him change her. When he presented her with a diamond necklace for their first public appearance, she pushed the velvet box away. She wore her own simple silver pendant, telling him that her identity was not for sale. At the engagement gala, Genevieve Roth watched them from across the ballroom, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She approached them, dripping with fake sweetness, but Margot deflected her passive-aggressive insults with effortless wit, leaving Genevieve fuming. Living together forced an unexpected closeness. They fought constantly over his controlling nature and her stubborn pride. But the ice began to crack during a sudden weekend storm. Trapped together in his estate, the power went out. Adrian found Margot in the dark library, lighting candles. They talked for hours, dropping their defenses. When a window blew open, scattering his important documents, they rushed to secure the room. In the chaos, Margot expertly tied a complex sailor's knot to secure the heavy shutters. Adrian asked where a diner waitress learned to handle rigging like a seasoned sailor. She looked away, her silence hanging heavy between them. Despite the secrets, the attraction was undeniable. He reached out, gently brushing the wet hair from her face. a quiet moment of tenderness that terrified them both. The fragile bond shattered 2 weeks later. Genevieve, obsessed with ruining Adrian, had hired a private investigator. She burst into Adrian's office, slamming a file onto his desk. Margot Ellis was a ghost. Her real name was Margot Sterling, the runaway heiress to the Sterling capital fortune. She had faked her disappearance 2 years ago to escape her deeply toxic, controlling family. When confronted, Margot did not deny it. She told Adrian the pain of living in a world obsessed with money was a poison she had sworn to leave behind. Adrian felt utterly betrayed. He had thought she was the only honest thing in his life, and now she was just another lie. For days they existed in a punishing silence. Margot packed her few belongings, preparing to leave once the contract expired. But Adrian realized that her lie was born of survival, not malice. He could not stand the emptiness of the house without her fire. Instead of buying her an expensive apology gift, he quietly purchased the diner where she used to work, placing the deed entirely in her name, ensuring she would always have a safe haven that belonged solely to her. But Genevieve was not finished. She cornered Margot, threatening to expose her location to the Sterling family unless she divorced Adrian immediately and walked away. If Margot refused, Genevieve would destroy them both in the press. Margot was terrified of returning to the abuse of her past, but she refused to let Adrian lose his legacy. They had to fight back together. The annual Maritime Gala was the most important night of the year. Genevieve took the stage, preparing to take over the company and expose Margot to the world. But before she could speak, the ballroom's massive audio system crackled to life. Adrian had used his vast resources to recover deleted audio files from his grandfather's estate. The entire room listened in stunned silence to a leaked recording of Genevieve clearly admitting that she had bribed the lawyers to forge the bizarre marriage clause in the will. The fallout was instantaneous. Investors turned their backs on Genevieve in disgust. She was escorted out by security, her reputation in ruins, screaming threats that no one cared to hear. Justice was swift and public. In the quiet aftermath of the empty ballroom, Adrian turned to Margot. There was no audience, no contract, and no pride left between them. He apologized for doubting her strength and confessed that he loved the woman who had challenged him, regardless of her name. He asked her to stay, not as a contractual obligation, but as his true partner. Margot smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and finally closed the distance between them, sealing their real beginning with a kiss. A year later, the corporate world of Vale Maritime was a distant memory. Adrian had stepped down as CEO, leaving the company in capable hands. He and Margot had bought a small, independent fleet of boats. They lived in a quiet coastal town, waking up to the sound of the ocean, building a life of simple adventure and genuine love, leaving the gilded cage behind forever. If you enjoyed this journey of love and resilience, please share it with someone who appreciates a great story. Do not forget to subscribe for more captivating tales. We will see you next time. Sebastian Kane sat in the leather chair of his sprawling corner office, staring coldly at the man who had just delivered an ultimatum. Theodore Kane, his father, and the ruthless founder of Kane Enterprises, had always viewed his son as a mere pawn on a corporate chessboard. The terms were absolute. Sebastian had to marry a woman from a pre-approved list of elite, easily manipulated socialites by the end of the month, or Theodore would invoke a forgotten clause to strip him of his position as CEO and cut him out of the family legacy entirely. Sebastian refused to be controlled. If his father wanted a marriage, he would get one, but it would be a bride who would make Theodore's aristocratic blood boil. That evening, Sebastian attended a crumbling community center in the city's poorest district, dragged there by his confident and loyal friend Benedict Cole, who insisted Sebastian needed a reality check. There he met Vivian Reed. She was a dedicated kindergarten teacher, fighting a losing battle to keep the center's doors open. When Sebastian accidentally knocked over a tray of paint, expecting the staff to rush to clean it up, Vivian simply handed him a mop and told him that in her classroom, everyone cleaned up their own messes, regardless of the designer labels on their suits. Sebastian was captivated by her fire. He offered her a deal. He would fully endow her community center for the next 20 years if she would marry him for 1 year to neutralize his father's threats. Vivian looked at the arrogant billionaire with clear disdain. She told him that using a sacred vow as a corporate loophole was pathetic, but she looked around at the leaking ceiling and the worn-out textbooks, knowing this money would save hundreds of children. She agreed, demanding ironclad legal protection for her school and refusing any personal allowance. The wedding was a tense, unsmiling event. Theodore Kane stood in the front row, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust as he looked at Vivian's simple, unbranded dress. When they arrived at Sebastian's ultra-modern penthouse, Vivian immediately claimed the smallest guest room. The next morning, Sebastian tried to give her an unlimited platinum credit card, insisting she needed to look the part of a Kane. Vivian slid the card back across the marble counter, telling him that she was his wife on paper, not his purchased property, and walked out to take the subway to work. The friction between them was a constant hum, but so was the undeniable magnetism. At elite dinners, Theodore constantly tried to belittle Vivian's profession, but Vivian fired back with sharp, articulate defenses that left the old man speechless, and Sebastian secretly thrilled. One evening, Vivian came home soaked from the rain and collapsed with a high fever. Sebastian did not call his private medical staff. He stayed up all night, bringing her water, placing cool cloths on her forehead, and listening to her feverish murmurs. When she woke up, she found the ruthless CEO asleep in a chair by her bed, looking entirely human. The walls between them began to crumble, but a shadow loomed over their fragile peace. One night, after a few glasses of wine, the conversation turned to the past. Vivian looked at the luxurious skyline outside their window and confessed her deepest secret. She had not chosen to teach in that impoverished district by accident. 10 years ago, a predatory financial scheme had wiped out her family's modest savings, driving her father to an early grave from the stress. She told Sebastian that she agreed to the marriage because she knew who had funded that shadowy scheme. It was Theodore Kane. She had entered his family to secure the endowment as forced restitution for the lives his father had destroyed. Sebastian felt the breath leave his lungs. He felt utterly betrayed, realizing he was just another pawn in a different kind of game. He retreated behind his walls of ice. For weeks, they barely spoke. The penthouse felt like a tomb. Yet, Sebastian could not ignore the truth in her words, nor the guilt of his family's sins. Instead of confronting her with anger, he quietly bought the building that housed her community center, securing its future permanently without attaching his name, a silent apology for the pain his family had caused. Theodore, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had dug into Vivian's past, discovering her connection to the victims of his old financial scheme. He cornered Vivian in the penthouse while Sebastian was away, threatening to completely obliterate her school and ruin her reputation in the press if she did not sign divorce papers and walk away quietly. He told her she was nothing but dirt on his shoes. Vivian refused to be intimidated, but she knew Theodore had the power to destroy the community she loved. When Sebastian returned, she told him everything, her voice breaking, admitting that while she came for restitution, she had accidentally fallen in love with him. The climax came at the annual Kane Enterprises shareholder banquet. Theodore took the microphone, preparing to announce Sebastian's failure, and stepped back in as CEO. But Sebastian and Vivian walked onto the stage together. Sebastian did not yell or lose his temper. With cold, surgical precision, he projected a series of old, heavily encrypted documents onto the massive screens behind them. They were the undeniable proof of Theodore's illegal financial schemes, the very ones that had destroyed Vivian's family. The ballroom erupted in shock. Theodore tried to silence the room, demanding loyalty from his old friends. But as the sheer scale of the corruption became clear, his allies turned their backs on him. One by one, the board members stood up and walked away from Theodore's table. He was left standing alone, stripped of his power and his dignity, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. Later that night, the penthouse was finally filled with warmth. Sebastian took Vivian's hands, looking at her with complete vulnerability. He asked her to forgive him for being blind to his family's cruelty, and he asked her to tear up their contract. He wanted a real marriage, built on truth and genuine love. Vivian smiled, the heavy burden of the past finally lifting from her shoulders, and kissed him, knowing they had both finally found their home. 3 years later, the cold corporate penthouse had been replaced by a warm, chaotic townhouse. Sebastian sat on the floor, laughing as he tried to assemble a wooden crib, while Vivian stood in the doorway, resting a hand on her heavily pregnant belly. They had rebuilt Kane Enterprises into a company that actually helped communities, and their own family was just beginning to grow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic brings together the 3 stories as variations of the same emotional journey, showing how relationships that begin as calculated agreements gradually become spaces of truth, healing, and transformation. In each story, the marriage contract is not romance, but a symbol of power, fear, and survival. Julian, Adrian, and Sebastian use wealth and influence to control difficult situations, while Sienna, Margot, and Vivian accept the arrangements because they are protecting something larger than themselves, whether it is a sick mother, personal freedom, or a vulnerable community. The relationships are unequal at first, but the women refuse to surrender their dignity or boundaries. The psychological section highlights the tension between control and vulnerability. The male characters hide weakness, dominate negotiations, and expect obedience, yet those habits make intimacy impossible. Their transformation begins when they depend on someone they cannot command. Small moments of care become more important than money. Sienna helping Julian through a migraine, Margot speaking honestly with Adrian during the storm, and Sebastian staying beside Vivian during her fever reveal the humanity beneath their emotional defenses. These scenes show that trust is not created by luxury or legal agreements, but through presence, empathy, and safety. The infographic also emphasizes betrayal and hidden identity because every couple must face a painful truth. Sienna carries the history of a family destroyed by corporate greed. Margot hides her real name to escape an abusive world of wealth and control. Vivian entered the Kane family partly to seek justice for the damage done to her father. When these truths are exposed, the relationships nearly collapse. The stories show that trust can only be rebuilt through accountability, honest communication, and meaningful action. The social themes connect the romances to class inequality, corporate abuse, and inherited privilege. The billionaire heroes benefit from systems that harmed ordinary families, while the heroines understand the human cost. Their intelligence and courage are essential to defeating Marcus, Genevieve, and Theodore. The women are not passive characters waiting to be rescued. They identify manipulation, resist humiliation, defend their communities, and help expose corruption. Their agency changes the balance of power in both the relationship and the business world. Restorative justice is one of the infographic's central ideas. The endings are not limited to declarations of love. Julian and Sienna create a foundation for small businesses. Sebastian and Vivian protect the community center and transform the company. Adrian and Margot reject the gilded cage and choose a simpler life built on freedom. These outcomes show that redemption requires more than regret. It requires repairing damage, sharing power, and creating safer futures for others. The main message is that real love begins when control ends. Power becomes meaningful only when it is used to listen, protect, respect boundaries, and make amends. That is why these stories connect with audiences. The romance feels earned because emotional growth is joined with justice, responsibility, and the courage to become better than the world that shaped them.